First of all, a huge thank you to Phil and Mary and others for inviting me to take part today. I am currently the Bishop of Durham. I also act as advocate for children amongst the Church of England bishops. I chair a group that tries to help Mary do her work for the Church of England. And as Phil noted, one of the very first prayer spaces that started in the diocese, in Ryton, in the URC church there. And it's been our delight and joy over the last couple of years to actually have Phil working with us as a diocese for 2 days a week, so that we've been able to establish prayer spaces in schools across a large number of schools in the diocese, not just church schools. Other schools have picked it up, secondary and primary. Our Leavers services, which happen in Durham Cathedral, have been completely transformed and are actually entirely prayer spaces until the last little gathering, which has enabled us. For example, we've got a diocesan conference coming up in a month's time. Here's some of the impact. So Phil is actually coming to run a prayer space for the entire weekend for all the adults who are coming as part of the diocesan conference. So that we've got children and young people taking part in the conference as well. But also, 3,000 Year 6 leavers have fed into us from doing prayer spaces in the cathedral as a leaver service what they think we should be doing in the future. So I'm a personal great fan. We have seen it having a massive impact on us in all kinds of different ways. I've been asked to talk particularly about the God bit. Now, I'm conscious that some of what I say will actually touch on the others. I'm in the advantageous position of going first. So anything that is said later has been nicked from me earlier. Or it might be God saying something to us through common thinking. Space matters. Part of my job is to serve in the House of Lords. It's been completely barking mad over the last few months. And one of the delights and joys in the last couple of weeks has been trying to get into the House of Lords from the underground at Westminster. Because Westminster Bridge the Bridge Street is actually shut at the moment, so there's no traffic going up. That should make life a lot easier. However, as I was chatting to one of the policemen, I said, "There's a lot of you around today." He said, "Yes." I said, "Is there another demo?" He said, "That's a permanent state of affairs, Bishop, at present." So to get across, there's always demos going on. And of course, you've got Brexiteers and Remainers all outside Parliament demonstrating. They're getting on incredibly well together most of the time. Some of them have been there every day for the last few months, so they've become quite good friends. And then you've got all the tourists, and then you've got so many blooming journalists wanting to catch the one photo that's going to make it onto the front of tomorrow's paper, that walking through has become a complete nightmare. I've always prided myself on being able to make my way through crowds. It has been a particularly joyous experience of trying to spot the space through which I can navigate along to the pier's entrance. Because the only way I can get there is to work through the spaces. Space matters. So, forgive me if you're not really into sport, but sports people do know the value of space. Doesn't matter which sport, really, almost. If you're into football, into basketball, into rugby, whatever, space matters because you look for the space. It's in the space that you find the opportunity. It's in the space that you create new possibilities. You're always, if you're a professional sports person in these kind of activities, looking to create space, looking to move into space, because you know that it's in the space that you will discover the fresh stuff, and you will fulfill what you're about. The very best attackers in football are those who make the space, because then they score. The very best try scorers in rugby are the ones who spot the space and find a way through it, and they've created it together as a team. So I think that built into the whole of our creation, into the whole of our being, the value of space God has given to us. And I want to suggest that prayer spaces is about my space, our space, and God's space, which picks up on really what Phil's already been sharing. There is something in the whole business of prayer spaces which is very personal. It's very much about my space. It's my opportunity to think, to reflect, to ponder. And clearly the research shows that whole kind of self thing. I haven't had a chance to look at the research. I'd love to know whether this came out. My observation going into schools and observing prayer spaces happening is that they are also our space. And there is a really deep sense in a school classroom or in a school community that this belongs to us. And we discover something together. It's not just about what I find, but it's about what we find. For us, I think in Durham, one of the ways that has really come out, you saw a quote from Jill Booth about the well-being impact. Ofsted commented on the impact of prayer spaces in that school and noted that it was one of the most significant things that was happening in that school. They have a real sense of this is our thing. So excited are they by it, but actually now in Durham, most of the training for primary schools is being done by pupils from secondary schools who have learnt about prayer spaces, run them, and they want children in primary schools to do it. So we don't need many adults around, really, frankly, now. It's the 14, 15, and 16-year-olds who are passing it on to the next generation. And in that setting, the corporate nature has become very clear. But it is about God, and it's about meeting with God and with the divine. And ask all the pupils, they know that this is about God, and they will talk about it. Because God is the one who meets us in the space. Because when we create space for God to meet us, we make ourselves available. We make ourselves accessible. And I suppose here's a theological reflection for you about why do I think this happens? Because God is so extraordinarily patient with us and so extraordinarily gracious with us that most of the time he never forces himself on any of us. He sits and waits until we create the space to say, okay. That's why God meets us in the space, because he never forces himself on us, and he doesn't on the children. It's a space, prayer spaces are a space for rest. So you're going to see over the next few slides my conviction that Jesus did prayer spaces. Mark 6, verse 31 is where Jesus, if I got 6:31, Jesus said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." Jesus knew that he needed space. He knew that his disciples needed space. They needed space for rest. Rest from the busyness. Rest from the usual. One of the things that I think that's been the impact of the prayer spaces in our schools has been that it is different from what you normally do in school. It's unusual. The physical space matters. the look and feel of the space. The fact that that prayer spaces engage with all our senses has been significant, and we need rest for all our senses. And so God is in the business, I think, through prayer spaces, of being and offering rest. They are also spaces for reflection. After all the busyness of the opening parts of Jesus' ministry at the beginning of Mark 1, he's healed Peter's mother-in-law, and they're all hunting for him, but he has gone up. He's got up early, he's gone out, he's gone up a hillside because he himself wanted space for reflection, space to think, space that was away from the noise and the distraction that was going on down in Capernaum. And the disciples, of course, on this instance, were a bit surprised when they found him. He said, "We're moving on. We're not going back down there. We're moving on." We, in our world, we are constantly battered, aren't we? By noise, by images, by everything. And we need mental space to declutter and to think. Arguably, one of the great weaknesses in our culture and our society at present is the lack of time taken to reflect. I would certainly argue that an awful lot of our political difficulties are because nobody is really reflecting. They're constantly reacting and driving without taking the time to reflect. And children and young people need time and space to reflect. Time where they are away from the clutter and the noise and all the distractions. And one of the things that prayer spaces does is it gives space. And God meets us when we stop to reflect. When we allow the distractions to go away. If I'm being brutally honest with myself about myself, sometimes when I walk into a room and it's completely still and quiet, the reason I put on the music or the reason I put on the radio is because I don't want to think. I want to be distracted by other noise. But I need to stop and think. And then the third thing is that these are spaces for wrestling. Oops, I've gone one too many. I'd like to suggest to you that Jesus in the wilderness, which is written about very briefly in Mark 1, that Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane are prayer spaces. They are places where Jesus himself wrestled with his calling right at the beginning and right at the end of his public ministry. They were places where Jesus himself was confronting hard questions and hard issues. Which is why, I think one of the reasons why prayer spaces work so well in helping young people and children wrestle with hard questions of life. Why things like the lifeboat and so on work so effectively. I should have noted at the beginning that all the pictures of the prayer spaces are ones that have been created somewhere in Durham. They may have nicked the idea from someone else, but they're all from Durham. They're all Durham prayer spaces. And things like Remembrance Sunday, or whenever you do it during the week ahead of that Sunday, allows people to wrestle. I find myself in preparing, therefore, thinking here about Jacob wrestling with God ahead of re-meeting Esau. Here he was, wondering what on earth was going to happen in relationship with his brother, whom he had defrauded and cheated and from whom he'd run away, and now he was coming back and knew he was going to have to face him, but actually discovers that what he's really got to do is wrestle with God, and then he'll be able to do some relating back to his brother. Or Moses out in the wilderness being caught by the burning bush and having to wrestle with God about what his calling was and where he was going to go. So prayer spaces give extraordinary space for wrestling with life's hard issues, including the hard issues about who am I, where am I going, what might I do with my life, and discovering in that perhaps God might have something to do with it, and God might have a calling on my life, and it might just be that I am called out to be someone and something different. One of the great lies, I would like to suggest, that we have to counter is you can be anything you want. That's not true. It's one of the biggest lies that's being regularly told. I was in a primary school the other day, and I asked a very simple question. Can you all be the best at everything? And they all shouted back, no. They all know it's not possible to be the very best at everything, because they know that some people are better than others, and so on. But what they absolutely do need to hear is, you can be absolutely the best human being that God made you to be. You can fulfill your own unique calling and your own unique abilities and be wonderful and the most wonderful human being as that. And I think it's in the wrestling that we help children discover who God wants them to be. And then the last is that there's space for renewal. Mary Magdalene in the garden after the resurrection. This is a glorious space for renewal. Or I've put on there the other story from John where they go out fishing and catch nothing, and then Peter is called and they have breakfast on the beach. There's a series, I would suggest, of prayer spaces that happen actually in that story. And in the renewing, we discover our identity. We find fresh new ways of being and doing. That's certainly what happened to Mary Magdalene as she met Jesus there. It's certainly what happened to Peter in that resurrection appearance. Prayer spaces are about renewal, and young people discover that renewal. Because at the end of the day, I think in prayer spaces, the God of space meets us in the spaces. And I've put there also constraining us and releasing us. And the picture is meant to try on the right is meant to illustrate that. God often has to constrain us, to put us into tight spots, to squeeze us into the place where we don't think we can ever get out of, so that we can then be released into the freedom and the open space that God wants for us. We often have to go into a tiny space to discover the release of space that God brings and longs for all of us, individually and together. The most extraordinary thing I remind myself from time to time, and when I go and sit in a prayer space in one of our schools, is the Almighty Creator of everything is meeting children and young people in this tiny little space. And he's doing so that they discover who they really are and can live out the glorious freedom that God longs for every human being.